Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creators, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. We're taking a slightly different look at things fantasy today because I'm going to be in conversation with Dr. Eleanor Baker, who has written a book with the Bodleian Library called The Book of Curses. So before you dive for cover, perhaps we better introduce Eleanor in her less dark demeanour. Eleanor, tell us a little bit about yourself and on the good side of what you're going to be talking about. I'm particularly interested if you wanted to talk about your work for the Astrophoria Foundation. So off you go.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. And yes, I'll put my best foot forward and try not to be too diabolical and
Yes.
curse-like today. So this book Curses ultimately came out of things that I was looking at during my doctorate. So I did my doctorate here at the University of Oxford. And what swung my decision to do it here was the complete wealth of medieval manuscripts that the Bodleian Library possesses. And as part of my research, I was looking at how people in the later medieval period in England, so around 1350 to 1550, how they understood what books were as material objects. So you get these references to books being perceived as holy objects or valuable objects, objects which can heal, objects which can curse. And I was really interested in where those ideas came from and what they were doing, because it's something that is, in some ways, not so far away from how we perceive books, in that people often express very strong opinions, for example, as to how you hold your place in a book. There are screams of horror, usually when I say that I'm someone who dog ears the pages of their books, that folds the corner down to keep their place. For some people, that is a cardinal sin of book reading. So I found that that was just an interesting concept that lasted over a long period of time and emphasized both the differences between the medieval period and us, but also the similarities as well. And book curses was something that I didn't have a chance to look at particularly closely in the doctorate. So I thought, well, now's an excellent time to do so. And since completing the doctorate, I have remained in Oxford teaching at various colleges. And one of the roles that I have is as the English subject lead for the relatively new Astrophoria Foundation Year programme. And the aim of that programme is to support students who have had personal disadvantage in their lives, they've been through some kind of difficulty, and maybe the initial usual application process to Oxford is not targeted enough to reach them, or they don't have enough information at that time to know if it's the right choice for them. And what we provide is essentially a supported program to get them in the position that they would need to be to study, to not just be able to meet the baseline requirements for studying at university, but to actually thrive when they get that. So that's holistic in terms of things like building up their confidence and learning how to prioritize, but also getting to grips with maybe some of the basic methodologies of, in my case, English literature that would help them fly once they to undergraduate study.
So if anyone is listening to this who perhaps they themselves are falling into this cohort or know somebody close to them who does, a very talented person who hasn't had the advantage of maybe a private education where they know how the Oxbridge system works, what's the best place for them to go to get more information?
The best place for them to go would be the University of Oxford website into the admissions section, and you can find all the information about what an Astrophoria application requires there.
Perfect. Right. So from the blessing of the Astrophoria Foundation year, let's turn to curses. So looking through the book, it's a beautifully produced book, as the Bodleian Library books often are. It is done chronologically. So you go from the very oldest curses that you could find to contemporary ones. We're talking about curses about books. Do you want to actually sort of explain the actual scope? Because obviously cursing more generally is a very long-standing human occupation, but we're talking about a particular kind of curse.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julia, you're completely right in that curses are found among the earliest of human writings. Curses have existed as long as writing has. So they're a kind of conceit, a way of imagining the power of the word that is quite familiar to us across different time periods. What I'm focused on in this book is curses which think about what is termed in academic study the material text. And that is what it sounds like. It's literally the thing that words are on. So we start off at the beginning of the book with examples from the ancient Near East in just before 3000 BCE. And as you say, we finish in the modern era. But the initial curses that we're looking at are written on monumental stone stelae, which are stone monuments which are taller than they are broad. And they were being inscribed with a text form called cuneiform, which is formed of little triangles which kind of pressed into clay or inscribed into stone. And they warn things like whoever defaces this text, whoever scrubs out the name of the king and replaces it with their own, will face the wrath of a multitude of different gods. So there's this warning about not editing the text, not destroying the monument. And this is picked up later on by medieval writers who then go on to write these curses when the technology to develop the book is made. So that condition, that desire to protect the written word and also the material thing that the written word is placed on is something that we've continued across different time periods, across literary history.
Of course, when we think of the pre-printing press age, just the huge expense of producing a text. I mean, no doubt it cost an awful lot of money to build one of these monumental stelae as well. So equally, you don't want that defaced. But let's just go to the medieval period where you've got all the parchment you have to produce, and then you've got the monks sitting up painstakingly hand copying everything. You wouldn't have a library of if you just we're both sitting in houses full of books. That was incredibly rare. The people who had books were very high status individuals. They would have been kings, they would have been bishops. Um, and the idea of somebody coming in and stealing a book would be the equivalent of stealing a jewel, literally. It's very high status. So you can see why a curse is employed. One of the things that came up again and again in the curses you found in the medieval period was the anathema curse. Do you want to talk a little bit about words that become almost like a magic spell curse?
Yeah, absolutely. You've really kind of struck at the heart of medieval curses there. You're completely right to identify that manuscripts made of parchment sheets, later paper sheets, bound in leather, sometimes really richly decorated in and of themselves as well. They might have kind of these elaborate gold settings with jewels literally on the front cover. So they become this form of treasure. But they're also treasuries in a different way, and they're kind of word treasuries
Mm.
because often these books were produced, as you identify, in scriptoria, so the writing rooms of monks and nuns. They were likely to contain theological or devotional texts. And so the text itself had an importance beyond the book itself. It's something of divine importance. Yeah, so you can absolutely see that there are lots of different layers of value that are kind of compounding together that might make someone want to protect it with a curse. In terms of the different phrases that people come up with, yeah, anathema literally means in Latin cursed. It obtains these connotations of excommunication, particularly of being removed from the society of the church, literally being cast out by by society as you know it. So the threat of being excommunicated, of being anathema, was really strong. But there's also a sense that anathema has this kind of incantatory quality in and of itself. It's a Latin word, um, and perhaps a word that, despite people knowing its meaning, has a sort of rhythmic quality to it as well. It's often placed in conjunction with another word, which is sort of a nonsense word in the way that it manifests. It's placed together with another word, anathema maranatha. And together they have this really incantatory quality. The letters are almost scrambled between the two words. And Maranatha doesn't actually mean anything. It doesn't directly translate. It's a process of transliteration. So it's moved from a different language with different letter forms into another. And therefore, the sense of the word, the meaning hasn't been translated well either. So it's almost got the same sense of abracadabra, that
Yeah.
this kind of the words themselves hold power, even if that power is not specific.
And hocus pocus.
And
And
hocus pocus,
coming
exactly.
up to date, it's expecto patronum and so on. These use, we can see how we have in our Western brain somewhere vaguely Latin sounding words equal magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, that's reflective of the differences in literacy rates and who had literacy and which languages were the vernacular, so the language of the spoken people, the spoken language of the people. So you can imagine for people whose spoken language was English and who perhaps didn't have the ability to read or write, would have gone to church services and heard Latin spoken. Words like anathema would hold that incantatory quality because they have a general sense of what that word evokes, but not a full conception of its meaning.
It puts me in mind, what was it, the neck verse that if you were able to save your life, if you had a capital sentence, if you were able to say a certain amount of church Latin to prove you were a person of learning. So it was
Wow.
I think they called it the neck verse. It was a very real, powerful word at the time. I don't know if it meant you were then put under church in church court as opposed to secular court. But anyway, I've always stuck in my mind this idea of a neck verse. It's very save yourself
That's so
from hanging.
fascinating. But that connection with kind of judicial processes as well is really interesting in regard to book curses because we can think as modern readers, oh, this is so far away from how we understand books. But then if you think of courts of law where you're asked to swear, often on a, well, you can, at most places, you can choose which text you're placing your hand on in order to swear your oath. So in many cases, people choose holy text. They might choose the Bible, for example. But people are offered the opportunity to choose any text which is of direct relevance to them, which has meaning for them, with the aim that you don't perjure yourself. You have to tell the truth. And the fact that we do that by swearing on books, I think, is really significant.
Oh, this is such a fascinating area. So, did you come up with a favorite curse?
I did. So I thought, particularly as this is a fantasy podcast, I wanted to choose one which has a fantastical element to it, which is a book curse where the narrative voice of the curse speaks as if it's the book itself. So it's written in the first person and it as if the book is speaking. So this is the book curse of Robert of Aldsworth. I'll just read the modern English translation. Robert of Aldsworth had this book written. I am for the community. I do not want to be separated. May I therefore be given to one as I am available to all. Whoever steals me or removes me, he will be cursed. The penalty for that person is anathema. And that is a book curse written at the beginning of a 13th century Bible that once belonged to one Robert of Aldsworth, the monks from Gloucester Cathedral. I think it's really interesting that Robert has taken his understanding of communal monkish living, in which you live in close quarters with lots of other people, and has transposed that onto the language used in the book curse, a book who perceives itself as one entity among a community and says, I don't want to be removed from my fellow books. I want to remain in the monastery. And that the book, it could be referring to other books, or it could be referring to the other brothers in the monastery. But the sense that the book itself has a voice and can express its wishes, I think has lots of potential for fantasy in particular.
Oh, that's wonderful. And it's such an imaginative way of writing a curse. I have a favorite because of the local interest. And this curse is from Abingdon and it suggests behavior to be repeated every year. So this is a book curse repeated every year by candlelight. The Book of the Church of St. Mary's in Abingdon. Whoever steals me, let him be anathema. This sentence is repeated every year in the chapter with a book and a candle. So you've got a whole. I hope they're still doing it at St Mary's Abingdon. It'll be a great, once a year you go from Harvest Festival to the Book Curse Sunday. That sounds rather fun.
Absolutely. And if they don't do it, I think they should bring it back. Absolutely. Yeah. And what I think is interesting about that book curse is that it's not quite clear what circumstances it's read under. So, as part of the liturgy, the performance of church services, you essentially make your way through the the span of the Bible every year. So you would go through the process of this text every year. It'd take you a year to read it. And it's not clear if the curse would just naturally then be read out as part of this annual reading, or if it would only be read out in a case of excommunication, which is usually indicated by the extinguishing of a candle flame, the ringing of a bell, and slamming a book together. So there's this interesting kind of ambiguity at quite where the book cursing comes in there.
So you have a specialism in medieval literature. Thinking about many medieval tales are fantastical. Can you think of any magical books or special books within medieval materials that reflect this external world of book curses and culture?
Oh, a really interesting question. So, what I immediately think of is the propensity for some people, especially in longer poems. I'm thinking particularly of authors like John Lydgate, to fall asleep whilst reading and then have fantastical visions. So, there's kind of a connection between proximity to the book and having these great visions. There's one text by the famous author Geoffrey Chaucer called The Parliament of Fowls, where somebody is reading and they're getting really frustrated that they don't understand the text. And then they have this vision of this otherworldly vision of how the world works. And it's just a really fascinating removal from the world of reading. But we have lots of other instances where magical things happen in relation to books. I wonder
Magical
if I can
object.
provide some examples in a different light.
Mm.
Um, so in one text called the Book of Margery Kemp,
Oh
which
yeah.
is the first, it's purported to be one of the first autobiographies that we have in the English language.
Bridget Jones' Diary.
Bridget Jones, yeah, absolutely. Spawned myriad forms. There's debate as to whether we can actually formally call it an autobiography because she had what we refer to as amanuensis. So she had scribes who she was dictating to, who
Mm.
then supposedly wrote her thoughts down. And she is saved by a book of hours that she carries in a church when a portion of the church architecture in the roof falls on her during a church service, and it should have been enough to kill her. And I laugh not because this is a particularly humorous episode, but because Margery Kemp is such an egregious character who is usually overcome with her devotion to Christ in church services that she starts uncontrollably crying. And the people around her, understandably, are very critical of this a lot of the time. She makes a nuisance of herself a lot of the time. Um, this portion of the church falls on her. By rights it should have killed her. It was enough stone to really get her, but it's implicitly credited in the text that it is her holding of a book of hours, looking at the words in the book of hours whilst they were being spoken in the church service, that saved her from a horrible death. We also have other interesting connections to the material text having what we might refer to as thaumaturgic power, so the power to heal or protect. We have these very unusual texts, some of which are on display at the British Library's Medieval Women exhibition at the moment, called birthing girdles, which are these long strips of parchment, which often have different visual depictions of the crucifixion and also some devotional works, which we think were draped over the belly of a pregnant woman as she was in labour. Um, it as a form of protection, as helping her deliver the child. And we have other references to similar charms that you could write down on different materials and then burn or eat, and they would have particular properties.
Oh, that's fascinating. Sort of gas and air for the medieval
Yeah,
birthing mother.
yeah,
I think it's easier. So we've medieval times, clearly a paucity of books, but by the time we get to later Renaissance, so time of Shakespeare onwards, we've got the printing press. Books are now more commonly available, and I think we can begin to see them cropping up in fantasy much more as a sort of talismanic object. Um, and the first person I thought of in this context was Prospero, who very much has to burn or
yes.
bury his books, doesn't he, in order to turn his back on the world of magic at the end of Tempest. So Shakespeare is aware of the power of the book and its connection to magicians reading spells out of it.
Absolutely. And I think that that sense of the power of the text as a material object, that kind of the significance of the things that are written in it bleeding in to the material object itself, and that in its own right having power. I think we see that repeated in fantasy literature in particular, time and time again. For kind of for good and for bad. I'm
Mm.
thinking also of the short stories of the late 19th and earliest 20th century writer M.R. James, who often includes these really interesting descriptions of medieval manuscripts, often because he was a medievalist. He worked at Cambridge for much of his life as a medieval manuscript cataloguer, and then goes on in these short stories, which often contain horrific ghosts or uncanny goings on. He often features books that are doing spooky things.
So, do you think that curses are actually the people writing them tended to think of them as like a magical power within the set of the words, or do you think that it was a psychological social pressure that brought along these bad things, or just a warning, like a law? What, or all of the above?
I'm going to take the academic coward's way out and say I
Okay.
think there are lots of different things happening at once. It's interesting that you used the word magic there because I thought initially when I started researching these curses, I thought, oh, I wonder if they're going to come up in books of esoteric knowledge, of alchemical knowledge, something that was a little bit divergent, a little bit unlicensed, challenging the boundaries of what was appropriate to examine in the world. But many of these curses, particularly in the medieval period, were penned by monks and nuns. They were not perceived as a diabolical force or something outside of the realms of God's power. They would often directly invoke holy characters from the Bible, holy figures, in order to emphasize the efficacy of that curse. So they're often working within preconceived frameworks of how the world works. But I think there is something interesting about that for the curse to be effective, presumably the other person has to fear it. There has to be sense that something bad will happen. I believe this might happen, so I'm going to err on the side of caution and not do it. So all book curses that I've come across have been conditional. If you do this, then this will happen.
Yeah.
So it requires a triggering of some sort, which again I think is probably excellent fodder for fantasy writers. Kind of the idea that something has to happen in order for this to be triggered um, is really fascinating. But yeah, in terms of how seriously they approach these things, I also think there's a great degree of variation. And I think some are more earnestly serious than others. I think it would be a mistake to look particularly at medieval examples and think that they were humorless people who thought that all of these kind of supernatural things were possible because they didn't have an understanding of the real world. I think they had a very nuanced understanding about how ideas regarding ownership um, and the threats that particular punishments offered, such as excommunication, or more obviously hanging, burning, drowning, all punishments which are offered in book curses, how they come up.
Yeah, and some of them are there's one about very graphic about something about sort of being poked or burnt. I mean, it's so over the top that
Yes.
it clearly is it's a far it's kind of undoes itself by its own
Yeah,
ridiculous
kind of hyperbolic nature. You think,
pie kind of thing.
yeah, even someone who was living in that period, I think it could be taken two different ways. Either that this is an incredibly important object and you really should fear these things happening, or that this is so hyperbolic it's not quite believable. Um, and I think they often straddle that liminal space of being serious but also humorous at the same time.
Yeah. I think one of the things it made me think about is back in the day when people sent letters, there was a chain letter thing going around when I was young in the sort of 70s and 80s. And you would suddenly get a letter and it would say, send this on to five other people. And if you don't do that, basically you're bad luck or some kind of threat within it. And even then, I remember getting one of these and thinking, "Ah, I just want to throw this
Maybe I
away."
should.
Yeah,
Yeah,
your
yeah,
your lizard brain or your sort of instinct saying, is there really going to be some kind of bad luck? It's like
yeah.
walking under a ladder, superstition. I didn't send it on because I thought I don't want to pass this on to somebody else. Um,
Part of you,
why would you?
yeah,
Why
you
would you
want
make the
to.
mystery go further?
Absolutely. And I remember the later iteration of this was you would receive it in email form.
Same
And it would
thing.
be, if, yeah, if you don't forward it on to five people, then something will happen. It is the modern reincarnation of the book curse, except I suspect those letters and those emails perhaps had a more fraudulent attempt in mind
Yeah.
than the book curses themselves. But it's that same logic, isn't it? When you receive something like that, you do think, is it worth just hedging my bets just to
Yeah.
make sure, just in case, because the chance, while it might not happen, the punishments are significant enough to make me think twice about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about curses in fantasy. And we can now come right up to date with fantasy. I was thinking that where do curses rest, particularly in Oxford fantasy? And coming out of your period, I've started thinking about Beowulf and the fact that the last of the third monster is a dragon who is asleep on a part, treasure, of course. And there's a sense that dragon's treasure itself is cursed, and you can trace. You've also got the Volsunga saga, which is the source for Fafnir and Sigurd and all that Ring saga stuff. Um, so you can see there's an association with treasure. Jeweled books can slip in there somewhere. And desiring it turns you into the dragon, the dragon sickness. And there's an easy step there to the Hobbit and Smaug and all of that. So clearly there is this power of the cursed object that I could trace from thinking about curses. That and in that case, it's a psychological triggering. Um, you don't need magic for that. You just need to desire it, and it turns you into the thing you desire. Thing.
Yeah, they operate in that funny space where it's not quite officially functioning as kind of a magic
Mm.
system. It almost ushers itself into being. If you believe hard enough, then it does happen. I think it's interesting that you mentioned Tolkien as well. And I was thinking, especially with the curse example that I chose, Tolkien is someone who also has a real interest in the objecthood of things and
Mm.
things that can talk. So I'm thinking, for example, of the riddles in The Hobbit, um, which are told between characters, and they bear an uncanny resemblance to the riddles of Old English literature, as you might expect with Tolkien, especially from the Exeter book. And these riddles are often about concrete objects, books, swords, vegetables, things like that. And they often end with the phrase, "Say what I am called." And you get this real sense of kind of speaking objects, or objects with which have agency in Tolkien's works as well, which I think is kind of related to that book curse, and the idea that the book can create its own curse and harbor its own sickness. I guess the same kind of logic with the inscribed rings.
Yes, and it's how you receive the ring is in a way defines how it then affects you.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so if you take it by force, that's very bad. So if you're a golem, it's you're on a downward trajectory. Where Bilbo's in the sort of grey area because he kind of
Hinterlands.
steals it, doesn't
Yeah,
he? He kind of steals it. But Frodo, he takes it on as a burden, as a inheritance, as something which he does not because he wants it, but because he's been asked. So,
yeah.
so he starts with a pure heart, and that so the curse takes much longer to work on him. The curse of the ring, the desire for power, is it takes a long time to work on him. Just going back to cursed books, I was thinking of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Do you remember the
Oh,
bit in The Magician's House? Have you remember that from reading it as a younger, where Lucy is sent upstairs to find the spell that undoes uh the Dufflepuds being invisible. So she bravely is sent upstairs by all the guys staying downstairs, and she comes across this amazing magical book where she starts turning the pages and she sees all sorts of spells and curses as she reads her way through it. And one of them, which is on this borderline, is the one to hear what people think about you. And so she listens
oh,
in on a conversation between her friend from school and the mean girl of her school on a train, where her friend is basically agreeing that Lucy Pevensey is a bit of a pill, you know. And so she hears bad about herself. So it's actually a curse that spell is
yeah.
a curse and that friendship. And Aslan, who talks to her later, basically says you
Don't
have
do
to
that.
you have to understand why she may have said that in those circumstances. It's not what you necessarily think. Don't change your mind because you've done something wrong, i.e., eavesdropped. So that is almost like a book of curses, that one.
Yeah, and that's
So
also an
it also
interesting.
contains, just before we leave it, it also contains the most wonderful story ever written, which she reads and then forgets when she turns the last page.
Oh,
It's a fabulous, wonderfully, it's a
as
wonderful.
I'm going to have to go back and reread that. I don't remember that at all. But it's interesting with what you said about reading the spell to be able to eavesdrop, because that's kind of like a double hidden knowledge, isn't it?
Mm.
She's found this book that she wouldn't ordinarily be reading, and she's then able to get this further insight into how people are speaking about her. And it's almost a warning against the dangers of knowing too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And how you get the knowledge is important as well. So it's okay
Yes.
to do something for somebody else. They've asked for the spell to be lifted so that they're visible. That's not something for herself. Whereas all the spells that may benefit her, like to be incredibly beautiful, you realize would all have a backlash.
Thing in the tail. Yeah.
In the tail, absolutely. But you, just before we started recording, you were talking to me about, of course, Deborah Harkness, which starts pretty much in the Bodleian Library, where you also were sitting to find all these curses.
Yes,
I'd
well,
love to
I
see
will.
your readers' request. Can I have all these books with curses
Yes,
on board?
absolutely. And I have to admit at this point that I did then listen a lot of the time while I was writing book curses to the soundtrack for the adaptation of A Discovery of Witches, to just feel a little bit more like I was Diana from the from
Yeah.
the book, looking at. But yeah, Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy uh, imagines a world in which there are vampires and other fantastical creatures. I won't give too much away.
Witches, we presume.
Witches, yes,
In the
witches
title.
significantly, yeah. Um, and there is a manuscript that's called up by a young academic who also turns out to be a witch called MS Ashmole 782, a manuscript of alchemical esoteric knowledge, which is in fact missing from the Bodleian libraries. So this is kind of a
Deborah,
filling of
what have you been up to?
yeah, I know, and Deborah is herself a book historian and a very accomplished academic. So clearly that fed into what she was doing. And I know that she herself found a manuscript associated with John Dee
Mm.
as part of her research. So a lot of it, she's excellent at kind of describing the physicality of manuscripts and what they look like. But this particular manuscript, you find out by the end of the series, is made of the skin of different creatures and is supposed to collectively tell their story. And I thought that was interesting. That was an interesting way to figure how books can be a repository of our identities and our sense of belonging and where they come from, that's often represented through their materiality as much as what's written on them. Um, People are very attached to their books, understandably. And it is a kind of harrowing reflection of a particular practice called anthropodermic bibliopagy, which is books made out of human skin or bound in human skin, which do exist, sadly, in the world. Often attributed to the medieval period, although they're not. The few examples that do exist date from the 17 and early 1800s. And there's been a big kind of scholarly effort to go through and DNA test a lot of the skin hair, and they turn out to be the usual animals that are used to make manuscripts. But there's that kind of haunting quality of what if books were people and people were books.
That does remind me of the Margaret Atwood saying that everything has in fantasy has existed somewhere in the world.
Yes, yes,
In the world.
horrifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was another text that this reminded me of, which I think is it's on the borderline of kind of historical fantasy fiction, which is Bridget Collins' The Binding. And that narrative imagines as kind of a parallel, a pseudo 19th century, where bookbinders have the power to seal human memories within books. And then you can kind of store them away, and the person who had those memories wouldn't have to suffer with them anymore. So people are thinking about the kind of capabilities of books, the powers of books in really interesting ways in fantasy literature in particular, I think.
And of course, you've got the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy if you want to nod up
Yes,
to
yes.
science fiction. And again, another way of using the book, which I've seen, is after the Richard Jasper Ford, The Air Affair, where you've got books, the liminal space between books and reality collapses. But you also find that in the Cornelia Funke stories. So this idea of the and oh gosh, my
Yeah,
end,
once you
the
think of
never-ending
it, there are a
story.
million. Yeah,
Yeah. So it's definitely a very strong thread. Uh,
yes.
all of those with the idea of books being a gateway access, like your wardrobe, into these other worlds. Not the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's a lovely standalone example of a wry commentary upon space, which is
But you've
really
just
big.
made yes, yes. You've just made me think as well of Jonathan Strange and Mr.
Norrell.
Norrell, which obviously a text which contains loads of references to magical books, how magical books work, but also significantly how they don't,
Mm.
how they cannot possibly capture magic appropriately, how that exists outside of books, and actually texts themselves are not the most efficacious means of enacting magic that comes from beyond the text. So I think also the limitations of books to do things, magic books that don't work.
That would be the kind I'd find, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Eleanor, thank you. It's been a fantastic survey of books and curses through the ages. What are you working on now?
So my interest is now turning almost, I think it is fantasy adjacent. I'm really interested in folk horror as a concept.
Mm.
Spooky supernatural goings on, especially figured in the British landscape. So I'm looking for more horror stories from the medieval period that are set in the English landscape in particular, because I think they're fascinating.
Wonderful. Oh, we look forward to hearing about that when you complete that particular project. So, as a little bit of fun, we're going to now give ourselves the chance to go off into any fantasy world of our choice. No fantasy world is barred to us. I want to know where you think it'd be the best place to be able to cast a curse over a library or a book, perhaps to keep it to yourself or maybe to affect those who are using it. So you can channel
Ooh.
your inner, you know, anti-hero if you wish.
Yeah, I think the medieval time period in particular, it would be particularly pertinent. Um, I'm trying to think of literature. I think actually maybe within the realms of Mallory's text, the Mort Data. So I'm gonna choose the kind of fantasy, pseudo-historical fantasy world of the Mort Data to cast my curse on medieval England. Maybe I'd curse in particular Merlin's books, which he has written, because Merlin's not particularly helpful character at any time. So I think yes, I go back then.
Wonderful. I think I would choose my favorite fantasy library, which is Garth Nix's Lyrial. So he's written a trilogy. I think it's just been picked up by Netflix or something. It starts with something called Sabriel, Lyrial, and then Abhorsen. Very interesting Australian writer. But Lyrial, the second of the books, has this most wonderful fantasy library. So I would sit there and cast a curse on it so that I could just go and read all the books and enjoy it, keep it to myself for a bit. That's what I would do. Mind you, I know that there would be a sting in that tale if I did so. Thank you so much, Eleanor, and good luck with your folk horror.
It is my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.